At 5:42 on a Saturday morning, 86 black Angus cattle came crashing through my orchard like somebody had opened the gates of hell. Branches snapped, irrigation pipes burst, and 30 years of careful work disappeared under mud and hooves, while the woman responsible watched from the roadside with a coffee in her hand. Then she smiled at me and gave a slow little wave, like destroying my family's land was just another item she could check off before breakfast. My name is Mason Rourke, and before that morning I thought I understood what hatred looked like. But I was wrong, because hatred is not always loud or wild. Sometimes it wears clean white sneakers, drives a pearl-colored SUV, and talks about community standards with a smile so polished you can almost see yourself losing in it. The orchard sat on 9 acres in the Catawba Valley, tucked between 2 wooded ridges where the fog settled low in the mornings and the air smelled like wet grass, cedar, and apples warming in the sun. My grandfather, Samuel, planted the first trees in 1967, mostly winesaps and golden delicious, because those were the varieties his father trusted, and Samuel did not believe in fixing anything that still worked. He was a quiet man with huge hands, a bent nose, and a habit of answering long questions with one sentence. When I was a kid, I followed him through the rows carrying tools I was too small to use, listening to him explain trees the way some men explain religion. Never rush a root, he used to say. Never trust a man who does. I inherited the place after he died in 2011, along with an old cider shed, 2 tractors that started only when they felt respected, and enough deferred repairs to make any sensible person call a realtor. At the time I was working commercial refrigeration in Roanoke, crawling through restaurant kitchens at 2 in the morning, fixing compressors while cooks shouted over fryers, and I knew exactly nothing about running an orchard. Everyone told me to sell. Developers had been circling a property for years, offering numbers that sounded big until you understood what land like that would become once it was cut into lots. I kept saying I would think about it, which was my polite way of saying no. My daughter, June, was 7 when we moved into the farmhouse full-time. She grew up with mud on her boots, apple leaves in her hair, and a better understanding of weather than most local news stations. By 13, she could run the pick-your-own check-in table, handle a card reader, explain which rows were open, and tell grown adults not to climb the trees without sounding rude. Every season, part of the money went into an account for her future, college, trade school, whatever she chose. I never pushed farming on her, but I wanted the land to give her options the way it had given me purpose. The trouble began when Celeste Varnell became president of Stonebridge Preserve, the subdivision that wrapped around our property on 3 sides. Stonebridge had been built in the early 2000s after my grandfather refused to sell the orchard, so the developer simply built around him. For nearly 20 years, the HOA treated us like what we were, neighbors outside their jurisdiction. Then, Celeste arrived. She had spent most of her career managing luxury apartment properties in Northern Virginia, and she carried herself like every room was a meeting she had already won. She wore expensive outdoor clothes that had never touched dirt and spoke in that soft, controlled voice people use when they want you to mistake aggression for professionalism. Her first offer to buy the orchard came 6 months after she took office. She sat across from me in the cider shed, glanced at the old beams like they offended her, and slid a printed proposal across the table. The number was nearly 20% below market value. I pushed it back. She smiled. "Mason," she said, "this area is changing." "It already changed," I told her. "That is why you are sitting in my barn." Her smile tightened, just a fraction, but I saw it. 3 months later, she tried again, this time telling me the HOA had concerns about traffic, noise, seasonal crowds, and visual inconsistency. Visual inconsistency was her way of describing apple trees, tractors, and a barn older than half the people living behind her gates. I told her the orchard was not for sale. She leaned closer and said, "Everything has a price." I said, "Maybe, but you cannot afford mine." That was the moment it became personal. The first certified letter arrived in January. Stonebridge claimed my cider shed was an unauthorized commercial structure and fined me $600 a week until I removed it or brought it into compliance with HOA architectural standards. The shed had been built in 1974, almost 30 years before Stonebridge existed. I called the management office, left 2 messages, and received no response. A week later, another letter came, then another. each one heavier with legal language and lighter on common sense. June found me at the kitchen table one evening with the papers spread out in front of me. "Are they serious?" she asked. "Very," I said. "Are they right?" "Not even close." She nodded toward the folder beside my elbow. "You're going to the meeting." "I am going to the meeting." She sighed the way teenagers do when their parents are about to make a principled mistake. "Bring your phone," she said. So I did. I turned on the recorder before walking into the Stonebridge clubhouse. Because Virginia allows one party to record a conversation, and because something about Celeste made me feel like facts might need witnesses, the room smelled like burnt coffee, carpet cleaner, and expensive perfume. Usually those meetings drew maybe 15 people, but that night there were nearly 50. Celeste had spent days telling residents that my orchard attracted pests, lowered home values, and operated without proper permits. She had built a jury before I knew there was a trial. When my turn came, I stood with my folder and explained that the shed predated the HOA. The orchard was protected agricultural use, and my parcel had never been part of Stonebridge. Celeste listened with a pleasant expression, then introduced Graham Pike, the HOA attorney, who was already seated in the back. He rose in a dark suit and explained that old property records were complicated. Agricultural protections had exceptions, and the HOA believed my parcel had been incorporated through recorded covenanters in 2002. Every time I tried to respond, Celeste cut me off. "Out of order, not relevant. The chair has ruled." She used procedure like a weapon, slicing away every chance I had to speak. Finally, I closed the folder and asked one question. "Is my parcel inside Stonebridge on the original county survey? Not your covenanters, the actual survey." For the first time all evening, Celeste hesitated. Then she said the recorded covenanters were controlling. "That is not what I asked," I said. The room went quiet. I sat down, and she moved on as if nothing had happened. Outside, the night air was sharp and smelled like pine smoke. I was halfway to my truck when an older man called my name. He was tall, gray-haired, wearing a faded work coat, and he had the stillness of somebody who had spent his life measuring things precisely. "My name is Walter Keene," he said. "I was on the original survey crew when Stonebridge was laid out." He looked back toward the clubhouse, then lowered his voice. "Your orchard was never inside that boundary. I know because I drew the line myself." He handed me a card. "Go to the county records office tomorrow. Ask for the original field survey, not the filed covenant map. Do it before somebody realizes you know what to look for." Then he walked away, leaving me alone under the parking lot lights with his card in one hand and the sudden, cold understanding that Celeste Barnell had not just tried to find me off my own land. Somebody had changed the land itself on paper. I drove home with Walter Keene's card on the passenger seat and the heater running too hot, but I still felt cold. June was asleep when I came in, one lamp burning over the kitchen sink because she knew I hated walking into a dark house. And I stood there for a while listening to the refrigerator hum, wondering how many years a lie had to survive before people started calling it history. At 8 the next morning, I called a property attorney named Rebecca Sloan. 2 local farmers had recommended her, separately, and both used the exact same words. "She does not scare easy." Rebecca called me back before 9, listened without interrupting, then said, "Go to the county records office today. Ask for the original field notes, the preliminary plat, and every recorded amendment tied to Stonebridge Preserve. Do not call ahead." I was standing at the counter by lunchtime. The clerk brought out a thick file and an old survey folded into a square so many times it felt like fabric. I spread it across a wooden table and found the orchard immediately. 9 acres clearly marked, clearly outside the subdivision boundary. There was no gray area, no overlapping line, no confusing notation. Somebody had taken a clean boundary and moved it. I photographed every page and sent the images to Rebecca from my truck. She called 20 minutes later. "Do not pay them $1, she said. "Do not sign anything. Do not meet Celeste alone. And put cameras on every side of your property." That last part sounded dramatic at the time. A week later, it sounded like prophecy. Celeste's next move came in the form of 3 county notices delivered on the same morning. One accused my pick-your-own weekends of operating as an illegal retail business. Another claimed the gravel parking area violated stormwater rules. The third said my cider equipment was an unlicensed food processing facility. I laid all 3 letters across the kitchen table while June ate toast and watched me with that patient expression teenagers save for adults who insist everything is fine. She pointed at the papers. Is that 1 problem or 3? 1 person, I said. She took another bite. That sounds worse. Rebecca handled the complaints with the calm efficiency of somebody taking apart a cheap clock. A retail accusation failed because on-farm sales were protected agricultural activity. The parking complaint failed because the gravel area existed years before the newer drainage ordinance. The cider issue had one narrow weakness: a permit renewal I had overlooked, so I corrected it before the county finished its review. 3 complaints disappeared in less than 2 weeks. Celeste had tried to bury me in paperwork, but all she really did was give Rebecca a reason to dig deeper. She started pulling in corporation records, developer files, old board minutes, insurance documents, and the financial history of the HOA itself. One evening, she called while I was cleaning the press. The barn smelled like apples, yeast, and old wood, and the last light was coming through the western window in long orange bars. I found the change, she said. In the preliminary survey, your parcel is outside. In the covenant filing 18 months later, it appears inside. There's no signed consent from your grandfather, no deed transfer, no court order, and no lawful amendment. Someone working for the original developer added it, so I was never in the HOA. That is what it looks like. There was a pause. Then she said, but I think the boundary is only half the problem. She explained that Stonebridge's reserve fund had been calculated using the number of parcels supposedly inside the community. For more than 20 years, my orchard had been included in that number, meaning the HOA's financial planning and reserve contributions were partly based on land it had no legal authority over. The current reserve balance was a little over $400,000. Rebecca believed we could ask the court to freeze the account while the ownership dispute was pending and demand repayment of the financial benefit tied to the false parcel count. I leaned against the cider press and stared out through the barn doors at the rows my grandfather had planted. Celeste thought she was fighting over a shed. She had no idea Rebecca had found a way to reach the one thing every HOA protects more fiercely than community harmony. It's money. For several weeks, nothing happened. No letters, no phone calls, no complaints. I almost believed Celeste had finally listened to her attorney and decided to back off. Then one cold Saturday morning in April, at 5:42, I woke to the sound of the orchard breaking. The noise was deep and rolling. Hooves pounding packed earth, branches cracking, metal fence panels rattling, cattle bawling in the dark. I ran barefoot to the window and saw black bodies moving between the trees. Dozens of them, breath steaming in the dawn. An irrigation line had already burst and was spraying water across the mud. 2 young apple trees were down, then 3. Then I saw Celeste at the roadside beside her SUV, holding a paper coffee cup, watching the destruction with her arms folded. She looked directly at me through the window and raised 2 fingers in a tiny wave. For maybe 4 seconds, I could not move. My grandfather had planted those rows before I was born. June had learned to walk between them. I had spent years bringing half-dead trees back into production, one season at a time, and now a woman who had never grown anything but resentment was watching cattle tear through them because I would not sell. Every part of me wanted to run outside and drag her into the mud. Instead, I called 911. I gave the address, described the active trespass, the number of animals, the vehicles at the road, and the damage I could see. Then I called Rebecca's emergency number and left a detailed message with the exact time. After that, I pulled on boots, went to the barn, and activated every camera. I'd installed 14 of them after our first conversation. Motion triggered, cloud backed, covering the road, fence line, equipment shed, and all major rows. The video showed something important immediately. The cattle had not wandered through a broken gate. 3 men on all-terrain vehicles were deliberately driving them into the center of the orchard. I saved the clips, recorded the live screen with my phone, and began narrating what I saw. Time, location, direction of movement, damage, faces, license plates. When you repair machinery for a living, you learn not to touch the broken system until you understand how it failed. I treated my own rage the same way. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived within 25 minutes. By then, the cattle were being pulled back toward the road, leaving deep tracks, broken branches, and manure across nearly 4 acres. 7 mature trees were snapped or uprooted. 11 younger trees were damaged, and hundreds of feet of drip line lay twisted in the mud. June came outside in a coat over her pajamas and stood beside me without speaking. One deputy watched the footage twice. "These animals were driven in," he said. "That is what I see," I told him. He looked toward the road where Celeste's SUV had already disappeared. "Do you know who arranged this?" I said I had a strong idea, but I wanted the evidence to answer that question. Around 10 that morning, a dusty pickup slowed at the entrance, stopped, then turned into the drive. A young man stepped out, maybe 23, wearing a work jacket with the name of a nearby cattle operation stitched over the pocket. His name was Eli Mercer. He'd been one of the men on the all-terrain vehicles. He looked sick. "I did not know what she planned," he said. "She told our boss you had approved grazing for weed control. Then last night she sent this." He held out his phone. The message thread showed Celeste's name and number. Her words were short and unmistakable. "Put them to the center rows. Make sure he watches. He needs to learn what happens when he fights the community." I read it twice, then looked at Eli. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I have a little girl," he said. "And if somebody did this to land my father left me, I would want one person to tell the truth." I photographed the entire conversation, including the number, timestamps, and earlier instructions. Eli agreed to speak with the deputies and drove away. I stood among the broken trees with mud around my boots and apple blossoms scattered across the ground like wet paper. Celeste had not merely made a mistake. She had documented her motive, ordered the damage, and handed me the direct connection Rebecca needed. 3 weeks later, Rebecca called and told me to sit down. She had finished tracing a reserve fund. If we filed for declaratory judgment, vandalism, business interference, and bad faith enforcement, she could also request an immediate freeze on Stonebridge's $400,000 reserve account. Celeste would no longer be able to use community money as her private legal weapon. Every attorney bill would have to come directly from current homeowner dues, and every neighbor she had manipulated would finally see the price of protecting her. I looked through the kitchen window toward the empty spaces where 7 trees had stood, then at June's college account statement lying beside the damage estimate. "File everything," I said. Rebecca was quiet for 1 second. "Everything. Everything," I said. And the next morning, while Celeste was still telling her board that I would eventually get tired and sell, Rebecca walked into the county courthouse carrying a complaint that could take away her authority, expose the false boundary, freeze the HOA's money, and turn one smug little wave at dawn into the most expensive mistake Celeste Barnell had ever made. The lawsuit landed on Stonebridge Preserve like a brick through a picture window. Quiet for 1 second. Then suddenly, everybody was shouting. Rebecca filed 5 claims. Declaratory judgment to prove the orchard had never belonged to the HOA. Intentional property damage. Interference with my business. Recovery of money tied to the false parcel count. And full attorney fees. Because Celeste had acted in bad faith from the beginning. She also secured a court order freezing the reserve account while the case was active, which meant Celeste could not use that $400,000 to keep paying lawyers to chase me off my own land. The HOA had to cover every new bill from current dues, and that was when her loyal supporters discovered principals become expensive when the invoice has your address on it. Pool repairs were postponed, landscaping contracts were reduced, and homeowners started asking why they were paying for a war against an orchard that existed before their houses did. Celeste responded the way people like her usually respond when facts stop cooperating. She went public. She used the neighborhood Facebook group to accuse me of running an unsafe commercial operation, claimed my cider had failed inspections, and suggested children had become sick after visiting the orchard. None of it was true. Rebecca told me not to argue online, so I took screenshots, saved timestamps, and kept working. Celeste emailed the managers of 2 farmers markets and urged them to remove me in the interest of public safety. Both managers forwarded the messages directly to me. One wrote, "I have known you 12 years. This sounds personal." Rebecca added defamation and more evidence of business interference to the case. Then Celeste called an emergency board meeting and convinced the remaining members to seek an injunction shutting down my fall harvest until the lawsuit ended. That was the one moment I genuinely felt afraid. The pick-your-own season paid most of our annual expenses, and June's future was tied to that income. I read the motion at the kitchen table while she stood at the sink, washing apples for dinner. "Can they shut us down?" she asked. "They can ask," I said. That was not her question, and we both knew it. Rebecca filed a response so thorough it felt less like a legal brief and more like an autopsy. She showed that Stonebridge had no authority over my land, no verified health complaints, no evidence of harm, and a documented pattern of retaliation. The judge heard arguments on a rainy Wednesday morning. Celeste sat across the courtroom in a navy suit, looking calm enough to make me wonder whether I had misunderstood the entire situation. Then Judge Nathaniel Crow asked her attorney one simple question. If the orchard is outside your recorded boundary, what gives your client standing to regulate it? Her attorney talked for almost 4 minutes without answering. The judge denied the injunction from the bench and said the HOA's conduct raised serious concerns about abuse of process. Celeste's attorney withdrew 2 weeks later. Her board began falling apart after that. One member resigned. Another turned over internal emails. And a contractor named Dale Mercer stood up at the next meeting and said, "We are draining this community to punish a man for refusing to sell his grandfather's farm." According to 3 people who called me afterward, the room applauded. The trial began 6 weeks later. Walter Keene took the stand first. Carrying the original field survey in a cardboard tube, he unfolded it across the evidence table and walked the judge through every line, marker, and reference point. "I drew this boundary in 2001, he said, tapping the edge of the orchard. The orchard was excluded by instruction of the developer because the owner refused to sell. Rebecca placed a later covenant map beside it. The line had shifted nearly 200 feet, swallowing my entire parcel without a deed, signature, or amendment." Walter looked at Celeste's attorney and said, "Land does not move because somebody redraws it." That sentence sat in the room like a hammer. Then Rebecca introduced the cattle footage. 14 camera angles, 3 vehicles, men driving the herd through the center rows while Celeste watched from the road. Finally, she read Celeste's message aloud. "Put them through the center rows. Make sure he watches. He needs to learn what happens when he fights the community." Celeste stared straight ahead, but I saw her jaw tighten. Her lawyer challenged the authenticity until Rebecca produced the phone carrier records and Eli Mercer's sworn statement. After that, there was nowhere left to hide. The HOA management company had also turned over archived emails proving an employee of the original developer added the orchard to the covenant map because including another parcel improved the reserve projections and made the development appear financially stronger. My grandfather had never agreed. He had never even been notified. Judge Crow ruled that afternoon. The orchard was not, and had never been, part of Stonebridge Preserve. Every fine, restriction, notice, and demand issued against me was void from the beginning. At the damages hearing the following month, the court awarded me $74,000 for destroyed trees, irrigation, fencing, and soil restoration, $42,000 for lost harvest revenue, $36,000 in attorney fees and costs, and $24,000 recovered from the portion of the reserve system built around the unauthorized parcel. The total came to $176,000, paid largely from the same reserve fund Celeste had treated like her personal war chest. The criminal case ended with probation, restitution, and a permanent record for Celeste and the cattle operator who accepted her money. She did not go to jail, which disappointed some people. But by then, I understood justice does not always arrive wearing handcuffs. Sometimes it arrives as a courtroom order, a frozen bank account, and 67% of your neighbors signing a petition to remove you from office. Celeste resigned before the recall vote. Her letter blamed division within the community and mentioned nothing about the cattle, the lies, or the land she tried to steal. Dale Mercer became the new HOA president, and his first official act was to send me a written apology on behalf of Stonebridge. I framed it, not because I needed the apology, but because my grandfather believed records mattered. That November, June and I planted 12 new trees where the damaged row had stood. We named it Samuel's Row. The ground was cold. The mountains were turning blue in the distance, and June pressed the soil around the final row with both hands. "Do you think he would be proud?" she asked. I looked across the orchard, at the old trees still standing and the young ones waiting for spring. "I think he would say we planted them too close," I told her. She laughed, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, the place felt completely ours again. I used part of the settlement to start a small agricultural scholarship for local students, and the next fall we held the biggest harvest festival in the orchard's history. Hundreds of people came, including families from Stonebridge. Dale shook my hand at the gate and said, "Best apples in the county." I told him they tasted better without legal fees. Here's the part people still argue about, though. Some neighbors said I should have settled early because the judgment damaged the reserve fund and forced innocent homeowners to pay higher dues. Maybe they are right. Those residents did not drive cattle through my trees, but many of them stood behind Celeste when she believed power made her untouchable. So tell me honestly, would you have taken the settlement and protected the neighborhood? Or would you have gone after every dollar once they attacked your family's legacy? Put your answer in the comments and tell me where you think justice ends and revenge begins.